Dave Talks Comics, Episode 85, For the Man Who Has Everything. Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, a program on the subjects of comic books and cartoons. I talk about comic books I have read and cartoons I have watched. I talk from my notes. I don't go panel by panel or scene by scene. I try to do more than just summarize the stories. This program is definitely not spoiler-free. I try not to spoil everything, but in the process of talking about these comic books and cartoons, and I'm actually going to be talking about a comic book and a cartoon on this episode, I'm going to spoil them in a number of ways. On this episode, I'm going to be talking about For the Man Who Has Everything, both the original version in Superman Annual number 11 and the cartoon version from Justice League Unlimited, Episode 2. For the Man Who Has Everything was written by Alan Moore and drawn by Dave Gibbons, the same team that did Watchmen. This is a pre-crisis story, as in pre-crisis on Infinite Earths. And it's also pre-Watchmen, although I've got to think that it can't be too much before Watchmen. If anything, I think that they were probably had done some work on Watchmen at this point. It was published in Superman Annual number 11, which came out in 1985. This is a story which kind of is split in basically two ways. For the Man Who Has Everything is basically a birthday story. It's Superman's birthday. And he's the man who has everything. And there's only 5 characters in the real world and in this story, and those are Superman, Batman, Robin, Wonder Woman, and the bad guy, Mongol. But part of the way this story opens is that Robin, well, the way it opens in the real world is that Batman, Robin, and Wonder Woman are arriving at the Fortress of Solitude. They are there for Superman's birthday. They've brought presents for him. And they walk in only to find him standing completely still with this plant attached to his chest, which you later learn is called the Black Mercy, and was delivered by Mongol, who is this alien who I think had only shown up once or twice before. I believe his first appearance was in an issue of DC Comics Presents. He has shown up a couple times in the Justice League cartoon and Justice League Unlimited. So Mongol is a bad guy. He has sent this plant, which has attached itself to Superman's chest and basically keeps him in this state. What the plant basically does is it gives him these dreams of what he wants to see, what Superman wants to see. And that's an interesting part of this story. So a good part of the story, probably a third of the story, are these dream scenes from what Superman is experiencing. And all these pages have red borders around them. But it's easy enough to tell which pages are taking place on Krypton and which aren't, just by the environment, the surroundings, the people, the way they're dressed. But what's interesting about this is that it's supposed to be Superman's heart's desire, but it quickly becomes a nightmare for him. He's living on Krypton. He's a grown man. He is married. He has 2 kids. His father is still alive. His mother has passed. but his father, his Jor-El, who in the real world put him in a rocket ship, which eventually made its way from Krypton to Earth as Krypton was exploding. His father is a very vindictive person at this point. Because Krypton didn't explode and he claimed it would, he was kicked off the Science Council decades before this story takes place. He has allied himself with a cult called the Sword of Ra, who are hardliners who they're hardliners, let's put it that way. They seem very conservative. They want to turn things back to the old way of doing things, it seems like. You don't get a lot of information on them. But so the story bounces back and forth between scenes where Batman and Robin and Wonder Woman are trying to wake up Superman and Superman's dream world, at least for, I'd say, the first 2/3 of the book. Eventually Superman comes out of this, but before he does, Mongol shows up and introduces himself to the three other heroes, and Wonder Woman takes him on and fights with him, and gets beaten pretty badly by Mongol. But finally Superman wakes up at the same time that Superman wakes up, because they managed to get the Black Mercy off of Superman. The Black Mercy attaches itself to Batman, and so then Batman goes into a dream world, and you get a little bit of that. Some of that you actually see, and some of that you're told about at the end. Like that in Batman's dream world, his parents don't die. His father actually fights off the person who in the real world killed them. And then you also learn later on that in this dream world, he married Kathy Kane. Now, what happens in the end is that Robin saves the day, and this is Jason Todd Robin. So because at this point, Dick Grayson had become Nightwing, probably a year and a half earlier, something like that, in the pages of New Teen Titans, or actually I think it was Tales of the New Teen Titans by then. Issue 42, I believe, was when something like that, when he became, it was during the Judas contract. Anyhow, so in the end, Robin manages to get the Black Mercy off of Batman without getting it attached to himself, and he manages to throw it while Superman is battling, because Wonder Woman's been badly beaten by Mongol. Superman is battling Mongol and is on the losing end of this fight at this point. But Robin manages to throw the Black Mercy onto Mongol, and then Mongol it goes into a dream world. Now, on the whole, I've read this story 3 times now. I read it a few years ago when I first bought it, not when it first came out, but I don't know, maybe 5-6 years ago, something like that. And I read it again a few months ago, maybe several months ago. I think it was earlier this year. And then I just read it again just now before doing this recording and making some notes for this recording. My original plan was to make this recording a while ago, but, well, things didn't work out. I was busy with other stuff, and now I've made the time to do it. I like it a little better now than I did originally. I have to say that my original introduction to the story was the Justice League Unlimited episode, which is the second episode of the 24 episodes that make up the season 1, or the first. 26. Yes, 26 or 24. Maybe it's 24 episodes. Anyhow, they make up the opening, but it's the second episode of Justice League Unlimited. And there are some differences, and I will get into that. I will talk about that. But I think on the whole, I prefer that. But now there are some things that I do very much like about this that I did not recognize at first when I first read this. And I think that's because I was comparing it to the cartoon too much. Now, this is the original material. It predates the cartoon by at least 15 years, maybe 17, 18 years, something like that. I'm not sure exactly when the cartoon came out. Maybe I can look that up. But what I do like about this, or what I find interesting about this, is, well, first off, let me talk about Superman's dream world a little bit. the Black Mercy is supposed to give him his heart's desire. At least that's the way Mongol puts it. So I really have to wonder what Alan Moore is doing here. I mean, was this just something that got changed and they never really reconciled the fact that Mongol claims that it's supposed to give Superman his heart's desire with the fact that it really gives him this nightmare where his world is coming apart, where these cultists that his father are involved in start protesting. His cousin, Kara, who of course in the real world becomes Supergirl, gets beaten up by some people who are opposed to these cultists. Another thing I didn't mention was that there's this whole movement to end the Phantom Zone, that they view the Phantom Zone as torture. And they want, there's a group, not the Sword of Rao, but there's another group, because the Phantom Zone, I believe, was invented by, the Phantom Zone Ray was invented by Jor-El, Superman's father, Kal-El's father. And so these people who were opposed to the Sword of Rao cult have beaten up Kara. And so there's a scene where he goes to visit her in the hospital. Of course, this is all, of course, in the dream world. But what I'm getting at is why isn't this Superman's heart's desire? I mean, why is it such a nightmare? What is Alan Moore trying to say about Superman? That he's got everything, that you can't give him everything? I mean, that's what the title implies for the man who has everything. That he thinks this is what he wants, but it quickly becomes clear that this isn't what he really wants, and that to be back on Krypton would not be a good thing, and that he can't change the past. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. I don't know if this is what is behind Alan Moore's thinking, behind his writing in this story. I'm really not sure. But I'm curious because there definitely seems to be a disconnect there between what happens with Superman and also what happens with Mongol, where both of them do seem to get their heart's desire, but Superman doesn't get his heart's desire. Or he seems to at first, but then it quickly becomes a nightmare. So it's just, I don't know, something that I couldn't help but think about, and I really didn't notice that until this third time that I read through it. The other thing that I find interesting is the art. And this is what I really like about the story. I really love the art in the story. Dave Gibbons does a beautiful job with this story. And there are some great panels in the story. I mean, you could start with the cover. The cover is beautiful, where you've got all five of the characters who are in the real world, but in the background you see the Krypton of the dream world. There's a lot of panels in here. The title page, which is not the first page, but I think the fourth page in this. Yes, I believe the fourth page, where Batman, Wonder Woman, and Robin have walked in and are seeing Superman standing in a coma or a catatonic state. I'm not sure what the right term is, but with this plant on him, just staring straight ahead. Other pages that any of the pages where you see cityscapes of Krypton are great, and I guess I think the same thing could be said of a lot of the cityscapes in Watchmen as well. And I'm not going to discuss Watchmen right now. It's been a while since I've read it, probably 6 years since the last time I read it. But I do love it, and I think it's a great story. The comic book. Not talking about the movie. Another great page, the page or the panel where Mongol shows up, which takes up about 2/3 of the page, and Mongol startles the other three heroes, Batman, Robin, and Wonder Woman. There's a panel where you see Mongol crouching down because he's much taller than the humans and the heroes, crouching down to talk to Batman. And telling Batman, I'm the new manager around here. And there's this evil look in Mongol's eyes. You can't see Batman's face in that panel, but you do in the previous panel. And it's just a great, I love it. And then what follows from that, a couple panels later, he says, which of you would it be polite to kill first? And then there's these few silent panels where the three heroes, especially Batman and Wonder Woman, are looking at one another. And then finally Wonder Woman steps forward and punches Mongol. I just love these panels. So after Wonder Woman punches Mongol, then a fight ensues between Mongol and Wonder Woman, and there's a great panel where you see Wonder Woman going crashing through a wall after she's been punched by Mongol, and it's just the way her body is. The whole scene, you really get the sense of motion in this panel of her going through this, the way her hair is, the way her body is, pieces of the wall that are coming crashing, that have broken off as she has gone through the wall. There's a great panel where Wonder Woman is blasting Mongol with a weapon that she found in, I think, what they call the Hall of Weapons. Then finally, when Batman gets the Black Mercy off of Mongol, but it lands on him. At first, Robin is consumed by Batman having the Black Mercy attached to him. He doesn't know what's going to happen, and then he hears something behind him, and it's Superman. Superman has woken up because he doesn't wake up immediately when the Black Mercy is detached from him, is ripped off of him. But Superman is angry. It's great. It's both the way it's drawn and the way it's colored. And there's this very red background, and Superman's very angry. Who did this to me? And then there's this great scene with Superman screaming Mongol's name and Robin putting his hands over his ears and flying backwards, just probably from the force of Superman's scream. At this point, Wonder Woman has been badly beaten by Mongol, but Superman shows up, and there's a great panel. I mean, a lot of these panels with the fight between Superman and Mongol are good, but the one that I really love is the one where Superman blasts Mongol in the chest with his heat vision. It's just great. And then finally, the panels that I really love, and probably the ones that possibly the ones that I love the best, some of the ones I love the best are when Robin throws the Black Mercy from above down onto Mongol, and you see Robin, you see the Black Mercy falling with Robin above it, then you see Mongol's face, but you don't see his whole face. You see his one eye, you see his mouth open agape, then you see a panel with the Black Mercy falling. And then finally, you see the Black Mercy attaching itself to his chest and this incredulous look on his face. So those are some great panels. They're all great, and Dave Gibbons does a great job with this. And honestly, I in some ways I really do like it for the artwork more than I like the story. It's a good story, and it's interesting to see what they do with the Kryptonian stuff. But like I said, at the same time, what is Alan Moore trying to say? Or he's got to be trying to say something with this. I mean, he's too intelligent, and he's too heady, too thinky to just do something like this and not be trying to say something. But anyhow, those are my thoughts on the comic book, the original story for The Man Who Has Everything, by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. And up next I am going to talk about the cartoon version of For the Man Who Has Everything, which is just a half hour, like I said, the second episode of Justice League Unlimited. Since I've already talked about the plot for the man who has everything, I'm now going to talk about the JLU episode version of it, which was the second episode of the first season. And I'm not going to go through it blow by blow, but I am going to go through what I see as some of the differences, especially some of the big differences. So one of the big differences right off the bat is that Robin is not he was in the comic book, but he's not in the cartoon, which is consistent with the fact that Robin does not show up at all in the Justice League or the Justice League Unlimited cartoons. So I think at this point they had either started or they were getting ready to start the the first Teen Titans Go cartoon, so that may have been why they didn't want to bring Robin in. Also, just for the fact that he hadn't showed up to that point, and there hadn't been any sidekicks, for that matter, up to that point. I don't think so. I don't think there have been any sidekicks in the Justice League and the JLU cartoons. Another difference is that in the comic book, it opens in the dream. In fact, it opens in the dream showing Kal-El, Superman, arriving home from a long day at work and finding a surprise birthday party for him. I think they call it something else, like first day instead of birthday. But in the cartoon, that's another difference. I don't consider this to be a major difference, but it's definitely a difference. Certainly in the way the story is structured, you don't get that surprise birthday scene. It's hinted that they were planning a surprise birthday party, but his son, Van-El, unwittingly reveals the fact that there was a party planned. In the dream, in the cartoon, Kal is married to Lois. Well, actually, according to what I read, it's not Lois, but it looks like Lois. Her name is Loana. And he has Brainiac as a servant, which I believe is consistent with the way Brainiac has been portrayed in the cartoon. Because in the cartoon, I believe Brainiac was originally created by Jor-El. And like Kal-El, Superman, survived the explosion of Krypton. So there's actually two survivors of Krypton. I believe that's the way it has been done in the cartoons. So here, Brainiac is actually a little robot, kind of looking like Herbie from the old Fantastic Four cartoons. Herbie also showed up during, I think, John Byrne's run on Fantastic Four. Another difference is that in the dream, Kal-El lives on a farm. He doesn't live in the city, which is more consistent with his roots on Earth, or with his, the fact that he grew up in a farm community of Smallville. But anyway, now the first sign of trouble, and I'm still talking about the dream here, is tremors. I guess, and I guess this could lead me to talk about what I see as the other major difference, the first being the exclusion of Robin, and that is the way Jor-El is played in this. In this, Jor-El is still a scientist. He has not gotten involved in politics. And I think that, so there's no cult of Rao in this. There's none of that. There's no Kara getting beaten up. It's all much more scientific and much more based around, because there's these tremors that are going on. And they concern Kal-El, but Jor-El says, don't worry about it. We've already predicted this stuff. We know about this stuff. But this is kind of the sign that something's going wrong. And it's a little easier to pick that up from this than it was in the comic book. In the comic book, I don't know, it wasn't clear. Obviously, he wakes up to a degree, because at the end, well, I'll get to that in a few minutes. Let me talk about what was going on in the real world at the time that some of this stuff is going on in the dream world, in Superman's dream world. So Mongul shows up. And Batman recognizes him, which he did not in the comic book. In the comic book, I guess that was their first meeting. Whereas I think it may be their first meeting in the cartoon, but Batman recognizes him from Superman having told him about him. And Mongul did show up in a previous story in Justice League. I think it was called War World, in which Superman and I think Hawkgirl and Green Lantern and Martian Manhunter, if I remember correctly, were captured while they were in space on some mission and wind up on War World, which is this gladiatorial combat world where they're forced to fight in an arena, and of course Mongul is in charge of this whole world. And, of course, well, I'm not going to go into the details, but if you want to watch it, I think it was from the first season of Justice League. And I'm makes me want to go back and watch that episode now. I don't think it was my favorite, but still, just to see how they portrayed him there. And I believe that was adapted from Mongol's first appearance in the comic books, which I believe was a 2 or a 3-parter in DC Comics Presents in the 20s somewhere. I believe that was done by Jim Starlin. I'm not sure if he wrote it, but I know I'm very sure that he drew it. One of the interesting things, a difference between the comic books and the cartoon is that in the cartoon, Mongol questions Superman's altruism. He speculates on what Superman is dreaming, that he's some ruler of some world or something like that. Whereas in the comic book, his speculation was completely different, and he didn't question Superman's altruism, which he does here, where he says something like to the effect of that, well, he's, that this whole Boy Scout thing is just an act that he's putting on. In the dream world, let's see, I mentioned Van El. You also get Crypto in the dream world. That's a nice little Easter egg. There are a number of lines that are lifted, some which are lifted directly and some which are modified from the comic book and put into the cartoon. In the comic book, or in the cartoon, when Wonder Woman attacks Mongol, Mongol says, "How nice of you to volunteer to be the first of your race to die." And there was something similar and I think I mentioned it when I was talking about the comic book. He says something along the lines of, "Which one of you should I kill first?" And then Wonder Woman attacks him, and then he says, "Well, that makes it easier," or something like that. I probably should look at the comic book, but I don't think it's that important. As in the comic book, they cut back and forth between the real world and the dream world. One thing that's interesting, in the cartoon, the Black Mercy appears for a moment in Jor-El's lab, floating in a tank. I mentioned that Jor-El's still a scientist, which was not the case in the comic book, where he became involved in politics, and I see that as a big difference. Superman's dream ends very similarly, or at least there are some lines that are exactly the same. It's a little different in that the planet blows up. You don't see the planet blowing up. You see it's like this. I'm not sure how to describe it. You should really look at the comic book if you want to see it. But the planet does not blow up in the comic book, but in the cartoon it does. You see all these volcanoes erupting in the middle of the city, and then you see the whole planet explode, and that's when Superman wakes up, and that's when the Black Mercy is removed by Batman from Superman, and it attaches itself to Batman. It's worth noting that I thought that in the cartoon, I found the cartoon to be much more moving. Both these scenes, in particular this scene where Superman, because it involves his son Van El, and who is, that's just in the dream, that's not in the real world, but it involves his son and him saying, I know that I don't think that you're real, and his son is crying and he's crying, and it's a very moving scene, and it's very well done. I think it's the voice actors, I think it's the music, neither of which you can get in the comic book. And that brings me to another thing, which is that when I reread the comic book this time, I couldn't help but hear the voice of Mongol from the cartoon. And Mongol in the cartoon is voiced by Eric Roberts. And I think he does a great job with the voice. So unlike in the comic book, it's Wonder Woman who removes the Black Mercy from Batman. His awakening is also, the end of his dream is also very moving, because his father is beating up Joe Chill, the person who actually killed him in the real world, him and his wife, Thomas and Martha Wayne. And it kind of gets very violent. His father just keeps punching this guy, and then you see a change, and it's also very moving. Not quite the same as when Superman leaves the dream. But still, it was also moving, and I think it was also because of the voice acting and the music. So that's more or less all of it. I think I've already talked about. There isn't a whole lot that's different. A lot of scenes are taken directly from the comic book, or they may not be done exactly like they are in the comic, but it's very similar. Very similar. Like I talked about that scene where Superman uses his heat vision and blasts Mongol in the chest, and that is in the cartoon. It's a little different, but it's there in the cartoon. Just a little different. And I mean, and a lot of the lines are lifted directly from the comic book. Some of them are changed a little bit, but directly from the comic book. Another difference, I think this is minor, it's not of real material difference, is Wonder Woman's present in the cartoon was actually the present that Batman gave to Superman in the comic book. And I don't know, it's just worth mentioning, I think. Let's see. Another thing I wanted to mention was that I noticed in the credits that Mike Farrell is credited as playing the role of Pa Kent. Now, I don't remember Pa Kent being in this. I looked this up in a couple places on the internet, and on the DC Animated Universe wiki page, they say he did the voice of Pa Kent. So I honestly don't remember, and I don't feel like going back to watch the whole thing again to try and figure out where Pa Kent was in this. But they also say that he's uncredited as doing the voice of Brainiac in this episode. And Brainiac in this episode does not sound like the Brainiac villain. It's a different Brainiac. Yeah, I mean it still has that three dot. If you've seen either Superman the Animated Universe, if you've seen any of the episodes that Brainiac in it, you might know what you should know what I mean. But it's almost like a toy. Like I said, he kind of looks like Herbie from the Fantastic Four cartoon or even the comic book. But it's not unusual that a voice actor would be uncredited, as I understand it, and I learned this from that podcast Talkin' Tunes, or maybe from one of the panels from the Phil Lamar panel that I went to a few years ago. But voice actors can be, when they're hired, they can be for a very small increase. They can be asked to play more than one part. I think up to 3 parts. And if they go over 3 parts, then they have to pay a whole new fee. You know, it's like you have to pay them double or something like that. But I think for just like 10% more, they can get them to play one more part. And in this episode, I believe that Kevin Conroy didn't do just the voice of Batman, but he also did the voice of Joe Chill in the scenes where Bruce Wayne's dream scenes, Batman's dream scenes. And then finally, well, maybe not finally, but as far as the cartoon goes, I thought that the last line, and this is a definite improvement over the comic book, I think. And there's some things I love about the comic book, and I've talked about those things, and most of it has to do with Dave Gibbons' art. But one thing that I think is a big improvement in the comic book, or in the cartoon over the comic book, is that they don't show you what Mongol's dreams are. Because in the end, the Black Mercy attaches itself to Mongol. And Mongol starts entering this dream world where where it's showing him his heart's desire. You hear some noises, but you don't see it. Whereas you get like 2 pages of it in the comic book, which when you compare it to the cartoon, it just pales in comparison. And then Batman has the last line, which is great, where Superman, or I think it's Wonder Woman, wonders, I wonder what he's seeing. And Batman says, whatever it is, it's too good for him. And that's just a great example of, of less is more, of just showing just a little bit, You see Mongol's face, but you don't see what he's seeing in the dream world. But you hear a little bit of noise, and then you get Batman's comment, and that's the last line in the cartoon. So, on the whole, I I like the cartoon better, and maybe that's because I saw the cartoon first. I didn't read this. This came out in 84. The cartoon came out, or 85. The cartoon came out in 2004, I believe August of 2004. So almost 20 years later. And I had never read it. I'd heard of it, but I had never read it. And I didn't read it for the first time until maybe 5-6 years ago, I think. So that's several years, 5 or 6 years after I saw the cartoon for the first time. Because I'm pretty sure I saw it when it first aired. So I think that's about it. That's my wrap up for The Man Who Has Everything. I think both the cartoon and the comic book are worth investigating if you haven't read them already. I haven't looked into it, but I'm pretty sure that comic book should be available on Comixology if you want to read it there. I have a physical copy of it. Actually, you can probably find it in back issue bins for $1 or $2. I mean, unless you want a copy that's in, that's CGC graded or in mint condition. And, of course, you can watch the episode. It's on Netflix. I think it's also available on Hulu. So definitely worth checking out. I think it's definitely a good episode. It does not tie in at all to the Cadmus storyline, but it's a very good episode. Oh, and one other thing that I read on this DC Animated Universe wiki page is that and I don't know, or maybe it was on Wikipedia, and I can't verify this, and I'm not sure if there's a source given for this, but that Alan Moore said that this is the only adaptation of his work that he's happy with. So that's it for The Man Who Has Everything, both the cartoon and the comic book. A few more thoughts before I end this episode. I mentioned other survivors of Krypton. How Superman and Brainiac were the only survivors of Krypton. Well, in the DC animated, and I was talking about the cartoon at that point, in the DC animated universe, that isn't completely correct. Now, you would think that Supergirl would be a survivor of Krypton, and that's what I thought until I looked up some information on her, and I had forgotten that in the animated series, she is actually from Argos, which is another planet that was near Krypton, whose inhabitants were from the same bloodline, were from the same people as the people of Krypton. But they weren't, so she didn't actually grow up on Krypton, so actually she wasn't Kryptonian. She was Argosian, I guess. But there was a couple other people who showed up in the animated series, the Superman the animated series, and those are Mala and Jack Sir, who were the Phantom Zone criminals. And they showed up in the episode called Absolute Power, and I've watched that. They were villains who had been sentenced to the Phantom Zone. I can't remember exactly how they escaped from the Phantom Zone. And as far as Supergirl, of course, she's appeared in a number of episodes of Justice League Unlimited, starting with the very first episode, Initiation. But as far as the Superman the Animated Series, she appeared in at least 2 stories, both of which were 2-parters. There was Little Girl Lost, and then there was Legacy. And I think there was another story in between those two, but maybe I'm not remembering correctly. I tried looking this up on a couple places, but I couldn't find a listing of the episodes that she was in. The final thing that I wanted to talk about is the previous appearance of Mongol on Justice League. And that was the story called War World, which I mentioned. Now, I thought that this was based on, because of the title, I thought that this was based on one of the first stories that Mongol appeared in, which was in DC Comics Presents. He first showed up in DC Comics Presents number 27. He was also in issue 28 and also issue 29. And this is all from research. I have not read these issues. Issue 28 is called War World. And so that's why I thought that the Justice League episode, or story, because it's a 2-parter, called War World, was based on that story. But when I was doing some research today, I found reference to another story that Mongol appears in. And after doing a little more research, I found that the War World story is kind of more based on a part of the Superman story from like 1988-89 called Exile. And it's the story it's like a 12-parter. It's spread across the 3 Superman titles of that time: Action Comics, Adventures of Superman, and Superman. And as I understand it, and I have not read any of these issues before, as I understand it, it all takes place away from Earth in space, and Superman feels as though Superman killed somebody. I believe it was another Kryptonian, and he doesn't feel it's right for him to be on Earth, and so he leaves Earth. And that's what Exile is about. Now, Exile has been collected. There is a trade of it, although it's out of print. Although when I looked it up on Amazon, it looks like you can get it for possibly as low as about $10, $12, but you should certainly be able to find a copy for $15 or $20, not including shipping. And I'm kind of curious. I'm kind of curious to read that and then maybe do a comparison, just like I did on this episode, between the parts of that story that deal with that Mongol is involved in and the War World episode or stories from Justice League. So maybe I'll do that at some point in the future. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is Comixology. I have bought a few comics through Comixology, and I really appreciate the fact that I'm able to get these comics digitally. And I really haven't bought many at this point, just a handful. Well, over the years I've bought a number, but still it's probably less than a couple dozen altogether. I like that. What I don't like about Comixology is I find their website to be very clunky. I find it to be very hard to find things on that website. I was looking when I was looking for these to see if the first stories that Mongol appeared in were available on Comixology. I tried looking up the issues. I tried looking up DC Comics Presents. Now they have some issues of DC Comics Presents, but they don't have issues 27, 28, and 29 available. So then I went looking elsewhere, and I found that those issues had been reprinted in a trade. Well, I went back to Comixology. I looked up that trade. The trade is there on Comixology, but there's no mention anywhere that this is a reprint of those issues. So I find that a bit frustrating. It's a clunky website. I find the search features, you really have to work at it, and sometimes it helps to find if you know something has been reprinted somewhere else to look for that collected edition, because they're not always going to make reference to the fact that the collected edition includes reprints of these particular issues. So that's my little rant on Comixology. I also, of course, use the Comic Book DB, which I find to be very good. It's not perfect, but it's good. I also use Grand Comics Database, comics.org. They both have their strengths and weaknesses, which I'm not going to go into right now, but they're definitely better for searching for things than Comixology is. And so that's all I want to say about Comixology and my endeavors to find things less expensively, or at least electronically, on Comixology. That's it for episode 85 of Dave Talks Comics. Dave Talks Comics can be found on the web at davetalkscomics.com and facebook.com/DaveTalksComics. On Twitter, @DaveTalksComics. Email can be sent to davetalkscomics@gmail.com. Next time on Dave Talks Comics, I will be talking about Alpha Flight, issues 13, 14, 15, and 16. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.